on board the American shuttle. For the first time, scientists will be working with astronauts in space. It's a joint venture between the European and American space agencies and will involve 70 different experiments, 6 of them British. Jane Corbin reports on what the scientists hope to achieve during their 9-day mission.
Spacelab is the first attempt by man to recreate the conditions of a well-equipped scientific Earth laboratory in the unique atmosphere of space. The laboratory will be manned during the 9-day mission, not by members of NASA's astronaut corps, but by 2 scientists, a German and an American, seen here in simulated zero gravity. Their backups, who will monitor developments back here, are a Dutchman and another American scientist. Spacelab is the first major collaboration between the European Space Agency, who've built the lab, and NASA, whose space shuttle will transport it. It's a much publicised relationship, which was severely strained last month when problems with the shuttle's engine delayed the mission and threatened some of the experiments. Spacelab was assembled in West Germany. More than 50 European industrial contractors have contributed to developments ranging from the construction of the manned pressurised module to the integration of scientific instruments. British Aerospace developed and built the pallets, which many of the instruments will be mounted on. To date, the Spacelab has cost £500 million. It contains 70 different experiments, European and American, from 8 different scientific disciplines, astronomy to medicine. The Spacelab module and the exposed pallets are fixed in the cargo hold of the shuttle during the 9-day mission. The scientists will crawl through a connecting tube from the living quarters in the nose of the craft to the laboratory. Once the payload doors are open and the lab and instruments are exposed, a thermal heat shield will protect the structures from the extremes of heat and cold experienced every 90 minutes as the orbiter circles the Earth. The 2 scientists, mission specialists they're called, have been in training for over a year now at the Marshall Space Center in Alabama. Unlike Earthbound scientists, they aren't restricted to one discipline. Ulf Merbold is a German physicist.
It gives us the opportunity to learn medicine, astronomy, plasma physics, material science. So it's a very unique opportunity to widen the scientific horizon.
Dr. Byron Lichtenberg is a specialist in biomedical engineering.
I think the most exciting thing is to be the scientist representatives, to get up there and actually do the experiments in space. And as you know, this is a multidisciplinary mission. I think it's terrific. I think it's the beginning of hopefully a beginning of a long-term cooperation between the United States and the European Space Agency and all of the other groups. The Japanese are getting involved in the shuttle. Now they're trying to fly Australians and Brazilians and Canadians. So I think it's the tip of an iceberg.
Inside the manned module are a series of removable racks for samples, incubators and centrifuges. There is a workbench, a data display unit and keyboards for communications via the computer to the experiments. The variety of investigations is considerable. Onboard furnaces to heat material samples to study their changes in weightlessness. And the scientists will use the shuttle crew as human guinea pigs. This helmet will measure the responses of the inner ear to gravity changes. Recent studies suggest that space sickness, which has dogged past missions, may be caused by a malfunction of the inner ear. All the human senses behave differently in the absence of gravity. One of the 6 British experiments aboard has been tried out on short simulated flights. Dr. Helen Ross from Stirling University was chosen from thousands to contribute work to Spacelab. It's a simple experiment requiring astronauts to differentiate between steel balls of the same size but varying weight. Dr. Ross worked with North Sea divers who had difficulty assessing the weight of objects underwater. Zero gravity presents similar problems. Only a prolonged mission will tell how astronauts adapt and what tasks they can perform.
The balls look like this, and they give them each a little shake and decide whether the first or the second was the heavier. And they do that for about a quarter of an hour, and I can correct the right and wrong answers and see how well they performed. And they do this at the start of the mission, and later on, after about 5 days, they'll do it again. And I hope to see whether they have shown adaptation between the first and the second test. And then they'll be tested once more when they land. to see if there's an after effect on the ground.
If man can adapt to space, then we may be able to use space laboratories for long-term medical projects, to study how cells divide and to manufacture new vaccines using the pure substances that can only be produced in a vacuum. And Spacelab's instruments will tell us more about our own atmosphere, and its remote sensing devices will produce maps of Earth's minerals and pollutants. The Spacelab can be used time and time again in a variety of configurations.
But later on, it is clear to me that we have to consider Spacelab as an intermediate step to a permanent space station.
And what I'd like to see is the true space lab concept coming about, where a scientist can devise an experiment, take off-the-shelf equipment, put it together, run through some minor tests, ship it down to Florida, bolt it in, plug in the power cables, and go fly. And this could all take place in a period of 5 or 6 months.
The Spacelab will be launched on Monday from Florida, with due back 9 days later. If all goes according to plan, then Spacelab could mark the beginning of real space-age technology.
Jane Corbin. For the past week, armed convoys have been converging on...
Golfing Society, they're having their due tonight in the Dorchester.
May delay today's launch of the space shuttle, but NASA is hoping to go ahead with the mission, which will place into orbit Europe's first space laboratory. Carol Fisk sends this report.
Later today, the 9th Space Shuttle mission will be launched from Cape Kennedy in Florida. This mission has particular interest for Europeans, as it will carry on board the West German-built Spacelab. STS-9 is dedicated to science, and for the first time, 2 of the crew are non-astronauts, a German and an American scientist.
1 degree.
Over the 9 days of the mission, there's a program of more than 70 experiments to conduct, many sponsored by European companies. Scientists from 14 countries will monitor the experiments from Houston. This will be the longest mission yet, and with 6 men on board, it has the largest crew. Carol Fisk for TV-AM News.
A man
In Britain there. It's 11 minutes to 7, and now some exciting stuff. We are now less than 24 hours away from the launch of this, the 9th flight of the American Space Shuttle. Now, it's a rather special flight for British space watchers, but first, Bob Friend reports from America on all the last-minute activity. Here's Bob.
The crew arrive for Europe's first foray into manned spaceflight, and it's the most ambitious scientific expedition so far.
We're delighted to be here again.
This will be Commander John Young's 6th trip in space. The Spacelab, which is about the size of a single-decker bus, was built by a consortium of 10 European countries. It will be mounted in the cargo bay of the shuttle. Scientists working on a shift system will man the laboratory 24 hours a day, conducting in all 70 scientific and engineering experiments.
This is a departure from the previous space missions. This is sort of the beginning of the new breed of space traveler, if you will. People coming not quite off the street yet, but almost. You know, the person next door.
Next door this time is West Germany, which has supplied the first non-American to take part in an American space flight.
I think it will be also very emotional to live in orbit for a few days once in your life and see the little Earth from above and see all the beautiful things like the oceans, the clouds, the high mountains, the stars, and these sort of things.
Only one problem looms. There are some doubts about the weather.
Well, the latest reports from Cape Canaveral indicate that that wasn't the shuttle actually falling there out of the sky. The shuttle should be launched at 4 o'clock this afternoon, our time. Now, our breakfast time expert is here on the space shuttle, Ian Ridpath. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
You all right?
I'm fine.
There wasn't a bit of the...
That wasn't me, no.
That wasn't the launching pad falling over we had there. Now, why is this not just another shuttle flight? I know it's almost got routine now, isn't it?
Well, it's Europe's first venture into manned space flight because the European Space Agency have built the tin can, the Spacelab space station, which will actually be flying in the cargo bay of the space shuttle in which the astronauts will be working for the next 9 days. But for me, the most exciting thing is that this is going to be the first chance we'll actually get to see of the shuttle in space, because it's due to be launched at 4 o'clock this afternoon, and a mere 20 minutes later it will be passing over Scotland. And here it is on its first orbit of the Earth. Just 20 minutes, it will have gone across the Atlantic and going across the middle of Scotland, and in particular at about Dundee. It will be overhead at about 4:21, and people in Scotland and the northeast of England should get a very good view of it as it goes over Scotland and drifts out over the North Sea.
What sort of height will it be at when it goes over?
It'll be at about 100 miles up, but it'll look just like a very bright star drifting slowly across the sky. You should be able to see it for 2 or 3 minutes in all if the weather is clear. Now, that's for Scotland and the northern part of the country. The rest of us will get a chance to see it on its second orbit. Now, I don't know about around the world in 80 days, but Columbia goes around the Earth in 90 minutes. So an hour and a half later, this will be its second orbit, and about 8 minutes to 6 tonight, it should be right over the middle of Ireland, heading for Wales. It will go overhead at Bristol, and about 6 minutes to 6, it will be virtually overhead the Isle of Wight, but you won't actually be able to see it then because it will have gone into eclipse. But anywhere in this area, Ireland, Wales, most of England, you'll be able to see this bright star coming out of the west, and as it catches the sun's light, it will appear brighter than any star in the sky, and it will seem to fade out as it goes into the Earth's shadow and goes into
Very
eclipse.
exciting, but dependent on the cloud cover, of course.
Indeed, yes,
depends on that.
if we get some gaps in the
Is
cloud.
there a British interest in this space shuttle, apart from a European one? Is there actually any British experiments on board?
Yes, there are a small number of British experiments. The thing that I'm wearing here at the moment is actually a British experiment. The poor old West German scientist, Ulf Merbold, who we just saw talking, he's going to be literally wired for sound. He'll have these electrodes, like, you know, half a mile of spaghetti stuck all over him, one on his chest, others stuck to his brain to measure his heart rate and his brain waves, and that will all be recorded on a small tape recorder here in his pouch, so that everything he does for the next 9 days in space, someone is going to know about. Pity the poor astronaut.
Could be highly embarrassing, yes. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Let's hope we get good cloud cover, or lack of it, tonight over Britain, so we actually get to see that. No doubt you'll be out there watching yourself, will you?
Oh, I am. I'm looking forward to this.
Now, it's the longest space shuttle flight that there's
is.
ever been, isn't it? Is it 1 day longer than the other ones?
It's a 9-day flight. The others have only been a week, and that's because of the wide range of experiments that are being done. There are over 70 experiments being done in orbit. And this is one reason why Ulf Merbold was chosen, because he is a scientist who's able to do a lot of different sorts of experiments, everything from looking at the sky to surveying the Earth and conducting experiments in the weightlessness of space on processing new sorts of materials in weightlessness. And that kind of experiment could be the forerunner of new sorts of space-based industries in time to come.
Ian, thank you very much indeed. And let's have some good watching tonight. Selina.
Hope so.
In just over 5 minutes, Blue Peter with some ideas for Christmas decorations. On BBC One First, here's John Craven's News Round.
Solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Columbia and the first flight of the European Space Agency's Space Lab. The shuttle has...
The space shuttle takes off and all goes well. Hello again. Scientists in Europe and America are celebrating this afternoon after the successful launch of the space shuttle Columbia. On board is the huge European Space Lab. There were fears that the mission would have to be delayed because of bad weather at the shuttle's launch site in Florida. But the weather held and everything went smoothly. Newsround space editor Reg Turnell reports from Cape Canaveral.
This is a flight of many firsts. 9 days, the longest. 6 men is the biggest ever crew. America is at last taking a foreigner into space. Last time the shuttle so nearly crashed, during this countdown everyone was nervous. Half the crew had breakfast, half lunch, because they're working day and night shifts. John Young, waiting to make a record 6th flight, seemed edgy. Ulf Merbold of Germany went aboard wearing 5 sensors on his head, more space sickness studies. But despite an approaching storm, Columbia soared safely through the clouds on her 6th flight. Europe's Space Lab, safe in the cargo bay, weighed a record 13 tons. In less than 3 hours, the astronauts will start floating through the docking tunnel, starting on their most ambitious science program, studying Earth, Sun and stars. And Columbia flies over Britain for the first time. With clear skies, she'll appear as a bright moving star over London at 5:42 tomorrow, 5:33 on Wednesday.
Plans which could help school leasing.
The news at 5:45 with Michael Nicholson.
With half of Fleet Street shut, both sides in print row go to arbitration. It's a perfect liftoff for Europe's own space lab and the drought that's killed 75,000.
Good evening. Releasing any satellites. It's a research mission, and the longest yet. It will last 9 days. Veteran astronaut John Young is the commander. It's his 6th trip into space, and the 2nd in Columbia. Despite a threat of bad weather, the shuttle was launched on time.
We have main engine start. 3, 2, 1. Solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Columbia and the first flight of the European Space Agency Space Lab. The shuttle has cleared the tower.
Space Lab should have been launched 2 years ago. Successive delays with the shuttle program have caused anxiety among the hundreds of scientists with experiments on board. Now, at last, they're in business.
It's not. Latest American space shuttle Columbia was launched this afternoon with a record 6 astronauts and a European space lab on board. 2 of the spacemen are scientists who will be conducting experiments in the flying laboratory. One of them is a first European on an American space mission.
This 9th shuttle flight is carrying a new breed of astronaut into orbit, the so-called shirt-sleeve scientist. Over the 9-day life of this mission, they'll be working strenuous 12-hour shifts, conducting more than 70 separate experiments in their orbiting laboratory. It's the culmination of more than 10 years' work between the American Space Agency NASA and the European Space Agency, which built Spacelab. The original ambitious complement of experiments on board has had to be cut back because of delays in the launch. Today, it was feared the weather would force another cancellation, but the liftoff was perfect and on time.
We have main engine start. 3, 2, 1. Solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Columbia and the first flight of the European Space Agency Space Lab. The shuttle has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll. In the first few hours of a mission, many astronauts suffer from space motion sickness. The scientists will be conducting an experiment to find out why it happens, and they'll have the benefit of experiencing it at first hand.
6 Britons were...
Less than 2 hours ago. This time the shuttle is a joint enterprise between NASA and ESA, the European Space Agency. And it's the first journey into orbit for the European Space Lab, in which a total of 37 scientific and technical experiments will be conducted. Following today's successful launch, Earthbound scientists will supervise the experiments from NASA's control room in Houston, Texas. And as Alan Douglas reports, Scotland has its own stake in the 9-day flight.
Solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Columbia.
The High Technology Space Center at Houston seems worlds away from the green rolling campus of Stirling University. But for Dr. Helen Ross and her research assistant Eric Brodie, it's just a small step from their regular work at the university's psychology department. For 7 years, Dr. Ross has been involved in research for the space program. And before she left for Texas, she explained what her latest experiments involved.
Well, the crew members have a box which contains 24 weighted balls. And all these balls are lettered with letters of the alphabet like this. And they have to pick them up and give them a little shake and decide which is heavier. They have a checklist like this which has letters of the alphabet on it in pairs. So they pick up first one, then the other, decide which is heavier and put a mark against the heavier one. And they do that for 72 pairs.
And what's the point of the exercise?
Well, this will show if they're as good at judging mass in the weightless state as they are at judging weight when they're on the ground. And I want to measure that at the beginning of the mission and at the end of the mission. And by comparing the results on these 2 occasions, I can see how long they take to adapt to the weightless state.
How difficult is it to assess the varying weights of these balls in weightless conditions? Because obviously it must be very difficult.
Well, I've tried it before in parabolic flights when you get about 25 seconds of zero gravity. And under those conditions, I found that people were about twice as bad as they were on the ground, but they could still do it.
Swooping flights in a specially converted NASA plane over the United States are the only way weightless conditions can be simulated. But they don't allow any detailed experiments, which is why Spacelab is being used.
Well, the difference is that in parabolic flight, you only get about 25 seconds at a time. and that does not allow man enough time to adapt to zero gravity. But in the Space Lab, you've got, on this occasion, 9 days, and this gives plenty of time to adapt, and so you can see what happens when man really has a chance.
While great advances have been made in space technology over the years, no one, it seems, has studied in depth the effects of prolonged weightlessness on the human body and the mind.
There's plenty of anecdotal evidence, but they've not made any very scientific experiments. And of course, we hope there are going to be a lot of future space missions, and man may well be living in space for some time, and it's important to know whether he's going to adapt quickly or only over a very long time scale to weightless conditions. The Russians in particular have said that they felt very heavy on the ground and that they felt maybe twice as heavy for a few days afterwards. And that's one of the things I shall be investigating too. When the crew return to the ground, myself and several other life scientists are going to be there in California, giving them the whole battery of tests all over again to see how long they take to readapt to Earth's gravity.
A grant from the Medical Research Council is helping to pay for a total of 24 experiments which are being sponsored by the European Space Agency. During the 9-day flight, Ulf Merbold, a German space-trained scientist, whom the Americans refer to as a payload specialist, will perform the tests under the control of Dr. Ross and Mr. Brody, who will man a console in the mission monitoring area in alternate 12-hour shifts. But wouldn't Dr. Ross rather be in Space Lab itself?
Well now, that would be absolutely fascinating, but at present the training period is very long, but if it gets down to being just a few months, then I would be very interested in going up and flying my own experiment.
After the mission's completed, the crew of 6 will have something to remind them of their excursion into space. As well as one of the weighted balls as a souvenir, they'll each be able to ponder on the comparative weight of another gift from the Scots, sticks of Edinburgh rock.
Well, from the space age to a glance into the past.
Start, 3, 2, 1, solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Columbia and the first flight of the European Space Agency Space Lab. The shuttle has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll.
The 6-man crew includes a West German, the first European ever on an American flight into space. Columbia's 9-day mission's the longest and most ambitious yet. The billion-dollar laboratory, built and donated by the 10 member nations of the European Space Agency, will be used for more than 70 experiments during the flight. 25 miles up and 2 minutes 6 seconds into her flight, Columbia's twin solid rocket boosters separated from the main craft.
Roger, SRB set.
The shuttle was clearly visible as it passed over Britain just before 6 o'clock tonight and will be again tomorrow.
At Cape Canaveral today, and the American Space Shuttle Columbia blasted off on time. It's Columbia's 9th flight, but for the first time the Europeans are playing a big part. On board is a space laboratory developed by the European Space Agency, and one of the crew is a German scientist.
It's the world's first purpose-built orbiting laboratory. Fixed in the cargo bay, it will provide a shirt-sleeve environment for scientists to perform their experiments in. There are 2 scientists on board, one of them Ulf Merbold from West Germany, the first non-American to fly on the shuttle. He's talked to fellow scientists in all 14 countries with experiments on board and found the experience worthwhile.
That gave all of us also the opportunity to refine our prejudgments and correct them. And I think in terms of human relation, it was also an enormous education.
It's the first time that 6 men have been launched together. They'll be working in shifts round the clock. They've got over 70 experiments to do during the mission. There are half a dozen British experiments on board. Veteran astronaut John Young is the commander. It's his 6th trip into space and the 2nd in Columbia. Despite a threat of bad weather, the shuttle was launched on time.
3, 2, 1, solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Columbia and the first flight of the European Space Agency Space Lab.
Space Lab should have been launched 2 years ago. Successive delays with the shuttle program have caused anxiety among the hundreds of scientists with experiments on board. Now at last, they're in business.
Roger.
The space shuttle carrying the first European Space Lab got away to a perfect start this afternoon. The 6 men on board will spend 9 days in space carrying out a series of scientific experiments. Even Commander John Young, making his 6th trip into space, was impressed. "It's just beautiful up here," he said. "It's really something."
This 9th shuttle flight includes a West German, the first European to travel on an American spacecraft, and the first of the so-called shirt-sleeve space scientists. The 9-day mission is the most ambitious space science project ever mounted. The scientists will work in round-the-clock shifts to conduct more than 70 separate experiments in their orbiting laboratory. The Space Lab, which will remain inside the shuttle's cargo bay, was built by the European Space Agency, and this flight marks the culmination of 10 years of work between Europe and America. Today, it was feared the weather would force it to be cancelled, but liftoff was perfect and spot on time.
3, 2, 1, solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Columbia and the first flight of the European Space Agency Space Lab. The shuttle has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll.
In the first few hours of any space flight, 50% of astronauts suffer from space motion sickness. This time, the scientists on board Space Lab will conduct an experiment to find out why it happens, and they'll have the benefit of experiencing it at first hand. That's just one of dozens of ideas for experiments designed by scientists in 11 European countries, America, Canada, and Japan. And those scientists will be able to talk directly to the astronauts about the progress of each of their experiments for the first time. Much rests on the overall success of this mission. America wants another 100 shuttle launches over the next decade to work towards a permanently manned space station. For Europe, which lacks a manned space launching capability, it provides a future platform for companies and organizations to conduct their own commercial and scientific activities in space.
In Mozambique in southern Africa, a civil war...
The 9th voyage of the American space shuttle Columbia has begun. The 6-man crew includes for the first time a European, Ulf Merbold, a German physicist. And Columbia is also carrying a European Space Lab research station. Despite the threat of disruptive weather, the launch was flawless.
3, 2, 1, solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Columbia and the first flight of the European Space Agency Space Lab. The shuttle has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll. Vehicle rolling from tail.
Now back to financial.
With the European Space Lab on board has begun its first full day in orbit after a successful launch from Cape Canaveral.
Welcome to Space Lab.
The first job for the 6-man crew was to officially start work in the European Space Lab inside the shuttle's hold. Scientists have set in motion the 70 or so experiments which are being carried out in Space Lab. The astronauts include the first non-American to join the shuttle flight, West German scientist Ulf Merbold. And Commander John Young, on his 6th space mission, proved he had lost none of his enthusiasm.
It is really something.
Astronauts on board the American Space Shuttle Columbia have been busy today with a series of tests using special harnesses and contact lenses to find out how space travel affects the human body. The European Space Lab in Columbia's cargo hold seems to be working well, but the astronauts have been having technical problems with some of their equipment. Newsround's space editor, Reg Turnhill, has been watching the activity from Cape Canaveral.
Space Lab scientists have already tackled 21 experiments, but the whole crew was needed to open the hatch giving access to the tunnel from Columbia into Space Lab.
Welcome to Space Lab.
Remote-controlled TV enabled us to watch Lichtenberg Garriott and Germany's Merbold into the space laboratory it's taken 10 years to design. First, they want to know how the body reacts to strenuous exercise while weightless. So Garriott, who's 53, was soon having his heartbeats measured. They're also trying to make themselves space-sick with sharp eye movements. And the scientists at Mission Control kept asking Merbold if he was wearing the special contact lenses provided for these tests. He's rather short-tempered.